morning, everybody. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. This is T. Falcon Napier, and we are continuing our discussion on neurotransmitters. So I had a wonderful discussion with Brian after our last call, and so I'd like to share with you some of the things that we chatted about then, and then I'd like to get into the remaining neurotransmitters that we haven't had an opportunity to really focus on quite as of yet. But one of the things that has come up again and again in this series of calls is that neurotransmitters are very short-acting. And by short acting, what Brian and Jane and others who are quite versed in the world of neurotransmitters mean is it could be micromilliseconds. It's not like some short acting thing is measured in minutes or any period longer, where there are other neurochemicals that are quite long acting, and that's where we start talking about things like hormones and peptides and proteins and lots of other little goodies that we might decide to put into our bowl of soup. So because of the discussion getting emphasized again and again and again that neurotransmitters are short acting, the kind of aha that slowly emerged in this series of calls is that neurotransmitters are more about tension management techniques, more about change grid maneuvers than they are about descriptive areas on the change grid, even though we've been able to show that there are certain regions of the change grid where we would expect to be moved if that neurotransmitter was being released. And so that to me was just a really, really great insight to be able to say, what exactly does a neurotransmitter do? And I know it's taken us 7 hours to get to this point, but as Brian has been saying from the very beginning, neurotransmitters make you move. And the moment he said move, which happened in the first few moments of the very first hour of the very first call we did, our head should have immediately gone, oh, it's about change grid maneuvers more than about a characteristic of a particular location on the change grid. So I'll just toss this back to Brian and say, so Brian, is what I've just said correct?
Oh, absolutely. Because if you think about the interoception, which is the monitoring, tracking of the internal states so that the neurons, nervous system basically tracks. So the sensations, the perceptions, thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. When you're dealing with that, the neurons just simply send a signal. And the signal is either a strong synaptic connection, and if it doesn't uh, take on the postsynaptic connection, then it's just repackaged. So whatever dies off is just repackaged or reuptake, as it's called, for further use. And so that's just the functionality of how they work.
And so that kind of gave me this little insights that I want to chat about for a few moments today about the dark side of the change grid. And so to get into that, I just want to refresh everyone's memory about two particular neurotransmitters. And the first one is the norepinephrine, or rather epinephrine or adrenaline, which is shown here as the red. So we know as far as its function goes, it's there to kind of save our butt in a life or death situation. So it's very much connected with the fight or flight response, and survival instinct comes kicking in. And so whether or not we are, I'll just say this, it's connected to perceived challenge. So when we encounter a situation, we perceive the challenge as being extremely high and our ability being, well, anywhere along the continuum, but nevertheless, usually very low, we're going to end up in a stress response very far up grid, and that epinephrine and adrenaline are going to be kicking in, or well, same thing, same chemical, going to be kicking in big time. The way we cope with it is what changes depending on whether or not we perceive our ability as being very, very low or very, very high. But it is the situation that instantaneously triggered the release, which instantaneously reinforced the movement on the change grid and triggered whatever the next wave of action happens to be. And we talked further and said that how does this perceived ability impact it? Well, if you think you are in a challenge of 12, so a truly life or death kind of a situation, and you view your ability as very low, are you likely to fight or flee? And the answer was, well, you're going to do your best to get away from whatever that threat happens to be. So that's probably more about flight. Where if you believe your ability is really quite high, you may choose to attack it head on. And that feels more like the fight sort of response. We also talked about freeze and fade and several variations that others of you were suggesting. So, but I just want to just remind you about this one little band of red that is indicating the level of, or the release of adrenaline or epinephrine. Now, the next one I want to remind you of is dopamine. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that is associated with pleasure. So it gives us a reward for whatever it is that we're doing. And as Brian has said on multiple occasions, dopamine just wants more dopamine. And so there is a bit of an addictive process that's in play. So you get a little, you want more. And so we talked about that the greatest release of dopamine occurs when you are in any of the danger zones, when you are at an extreme, because any and all of these danger zones do represent an opportunity to successfully manage a situation, to conquer whatever threatens you, or to leverage it in some sort of a way that brings you greater levels of satisfaction, joy, etc. That can be upgrid, outgrid, downgrid, or ingrid. Usually we talk about, or we recognize dopamine's connection to upgrid, outgrid, and downgrid, but there is also an ingrid sort of a thing. And someone brought up the question, why does ingrid feel like it gets ignored a lot? It's not so much that it gets ignored as much as we don't encounter it, because people, if such people exist that are by nature in grid, they tend to be less social, less active, less out there, and so we just don't really encounter them as frequently as the other types, which tend to be more present, more noticeable, more demanding, more whatever you want to throw out there as a descriptor. Okay, so just keep in mind that dopamine wants more dopamine. Whatever it is that's bringing you that release of dopamine, that reward, you are being kind of encouraged to repeat that behavior to bring more and more. So Brian, I've said that correctly, yes?
Yes.
All right, so last time around, we started talking about the dark side of the change grid. And this is what happens, and I know I need to magnify this for you guys to be able to see it a little bit better. What happens when these four danger zones unite at the back side of the change grid, or the bottom of the ball, however you want to look at it. So we're looking at the change grid as a three-dimensional sphere. And so the power point is at one pole, and these powerless points come together to become one single one at the bottom of the change, at the bottom of the sphere, if you will, the other pole. And then we looked at some of these things and said, you know, when people are in the upgrade danger zone, they start to have experiences and behaviors that come across as being very dangerous, haphazard, frightened, reactive, threatened, undisciplined. All these little words begin to apply. And as we get closer and closer to the exact center, these adjectives become increasingly, I want to say, profound, problematic, intensified, whatever word you want to use to describe that. And then if we looked out grid, these are the more of the fight sort of adjectives. Again, we're in the danger zone, but this is where we come across as being destructive, wicked, aggressive, domineering, dominating, relentless, unsympathetic, controlling, exploitive, cocky, egocentric. I mean, you can kind of read them all. And if you get right to the exact center, now we get arrogant, autocratic, brutal, cruel, those sorts of things. All right, and so again, I'm just bringing you guys all up to speed. What I wanted to do in the next couple of slides is to show you then what's happening as far as the neurotransmitters are concerned as we get to the dark side of the change grid. And so I'm going to put this first one up. You are looking at adrenaline or epinephrine. The darker the shade of red, the stronger the dose or the release of epinephrine would be. So if you guys can kind of look at the adjective map a little bit and see what happens as that release gets stronger and stronger. Just kind of talk a little bit about that. Tell me if you kind of feel how that's connecting, how that might end up exhibiting itself behaviorally in the individual, what that might feel like to experience. Take it any direction you might like to go, but let's talk a little bit about what you're looking at now. So, anyone?
Yeah, this is Brian. I can see that happening because think about it, the behaviors that are far down grid,
Mm-hmm.
the apathetic kinds of behaviors, they most likely will have strong synaptic connection. So I talk about that app, the strong association, strong pattern, strong programming or process. And
Yes.
so whenever you do a change grid maneuver, an upgrade maneuver, so you're increasing the standards, you're awakening the motions, boosting accountability, any of those, you now presented a new presentation of agitation and stress. So you just disrupted the app. So
Mm.
automatically they're going to feel disrupted. They're going to feel as if they're out of control. And so automatically what norepinephrine would do is put the spotlight on that, wow, okay, this is the app that's currently in place. So you have to, look at what the possibilities are now. So norepinephrine will act like that spotlight. It'll give you the focus.
Right, and
You
so, yeah, I'll show everyone that diagram. So this layer would show that. So the epinephrine or adrenaline has, I don't know if it's distorted reality, but it has certainly instantaneously demanded your immediate and undivided attention.
Mhm.
But the noradrenaline then comes along, the norepinephrine, which is shown as the blue, says, wait, 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 let's focus on what is real. Let's focus on what's actually happening and then see how that might impact whatever decisions and actions we move on to in the next wave. Is that what you're getting at?
Absolutely. Put
Right.
the
So
spotlight on it.
so norepinephrine, noradrenaline is a downgrid maneuver as far as neurotransmitters are concerned. They're moving us to a better spot. Okay, good. Thanks for that. Who else wants to add something about how we're seeing this overlay? I'm trying to make things bigger, but I think I'm distorting the diagram. Oh, it doesn't matter. I can fix it later. All right. Anyone, you feel free to chime in if you have something you'd like to throw in, but I just want to throw one thing out there, and that is that if we look at these outgrid words that are most um, associated with adrenaline release or epinephrine, we see words like autocratic, brutal, cruel, delusional, all these things are there. Do we believe that these behaviors then are actually the result of just that neurotransmitter being released in that moment? And because the neurotransmitters are short-lived, does that mean that that arrogant, autocratic, brutal, whatever behavior is going to dissipate just as quickly as it appeared? Or can any of us think of anybody in our entire life who have basically got to that location on the change grid and made it home? So they're always there. They're always behaving in these outgrid danger zone sorts of ways. So it isn't just a one time I'm threatened, so I need to fight. And so in that one moment, I'm willing to become dominating and forceful. I'm willing to become confrontational. I'm willing to become inflexible, but it's not where I live. So thoughts about that? Do any of you, can you think of anybody, anywhere, any area of life that seems to be living in this area? And then the follow-up question will be, are they experiencing a continuous release of adrenaline or something else going on?
This is Kathy. I'm just going to pipe in and say, yes, I do think there are people who live there. I mean, then they're labeled psychologically as having some sort of illness, probably. If they live there, I don't know what happens from a neurotransmitter perspective, but I think that we probably have heard about people and witnessed to some degree some of that. Whether it's constant or not, I don't know, but I think there's there are people who live there a lot of the time.
Mhm, mhm.
Mhm.
Thank you. All right, who else? Edie, I see you're unmuted. Brian, you're unmuted.
I would say that Kathy's spot on. As long as that app is uh, has room to work with the right context, it will work. So in other words, it can be enacted at any point in time. And that's where we see people who they go in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out. And it just, you start to wonder, like, how is it so easily that they just become enraged?
Mhm, mhm.
Well, it's the app at work. You know, it's this neurotransmitter soup at work.
Yeah.
And so as long as it's something that they can apply it to, and I'm talking about all the full breadth of context there, the right, you know, situation and all those kinds of things, then they'll do it.
Mhm.
The right reward is there, so the dopamine effect is there. So all these
Right. In
things
fact,
there.
let me scroll because I wanted to add that element
Um,
to it as well. Edie, go right ahead, dear.
it's okay. I'm still thinking. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Because I have a puzzle that I'm slowly but surely going to get around to. But all right, this is dopamine. So dopamine is at its absolute highest level at the powerless point. So that's why the blue is darkest there. And then as you move away from it in any direction, the level of dopamine is going to subside. Well, what that means, because dopamine is a reward and reinforces itself, encourages it to the behavior to continue, that means that someone is deriving some sort of reward or some sort of satisfaction from being cruel and arrogant and bigoted and warmongering and exploitive and all these sorts of things. Somehow or another, this is satisfying them in
Mhm.
some sort of a way. And like similarly, downgrid and ingrid, we could work our way. Let's, you know, I'm focusing on outgrid because I think it's the most vivid. Um, but I thought that's interesting. And so is it the adrenaline that's keeping them in this spot? Is it the dopamine that's triggering them in the spot? You know, and I have a third one here. I decided to put the both of them together. I couldn't perfectly blend the colors, but don't forget that that deep red is going all the way down this diagonal. It just happens to be right where the blue is strongest too. So I don't know any better way to kind of depict it. But it just makes me wonder. And I'm going to ask one other question specifically about neurotransmitters. If there is a person who, for whatever reason, has grown accustomed to a rather constant flow of both dopamine and adrenaline, do they have a new normal, which means for them there is another situation that would release even more adrenaline, even more dopamine? Or is the fact is that everybody basically has the same amount of these neurotransmitters, and these neurotransmitters, when they're released at this high soup kind of recipe, everyone could become this set of descriptors. So I know I don't know any other way to put it other than, when someone gets here, is that as bad as it can possibly get? Or is there a whole new level of evil that they could move to that the change grid actually doesn't have a spot for? Are they like right here at this intersection of, you know, where the sun's going to explode? I'm just wondering how bad it can get when we're witnessing horrible, horrible behaviors.
Yeah, I think Kathy hit on it, you know, because you do have psychological illnesses. You know, think about the typically when someone murders someone, right? There's
Mhm.
a sense of remorse there.
Mm.
There are
Well,
people who that doesn't happen. And so they, you know, have some kind of neurological disorder where they just don't care. Like they can't see the fact that they're actually harming someone else. So, you know, when you talk about these neurotransmitters, we all have different baseline points, but the significance and why something like dopamine is so powerful, dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, histamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, these are neuromodulators. So that means they can they influence neurons in different regions. all at the same time.
If I can comment here, I mean, when I was recovering from my ankle break, I immersed myself in murder mysteries, and there's and I read about enough serial killers to know that
Exactly.
there is a whole market for this out there.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, you know what? There was something on 2020 or Dateline this last Friday, or just wherever. But it's the guy that killed 52 people. He was an African American guy. Did anybody else see it? And I remember in court he said, while she was pleading for the pleasure of her life, she was fighting against my pleasure to kill her.
Wow.
And yeah, and then I'm thinking Kissinger, if you guys are old enough to remember him, once said that power was the ultimate aphrodisiac. And apparently, you know, I've worked a lot with eating disorders too. And, you know, the power center, the sexual center, and the eating center, apparently, Brian, you know more about this than I do, but they're like pinpoints away. So that's why, you know, so much obesity and eating disorders are associated with, you know, being sexually molested. And so those three all tend to overlap. I mean, if somebody's overweight, the first thing I ask is, were you sexually abused? And most times they have been. And so, or there was something very traumatic. But I going back to the guy on Dateline or whatever it was, and he said it with a smile, where, you know, there was so much pleasure in the power of overcoming her pleasure to live.
Ugh.
Is it? Yeah.
There are a lot of people like that out there, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
So,
See,
and
so
it's
when
more than being, it's more than being just disengaged and not caring.
right.
Yeah, I just wanted to point that out.
The app really creates a structure, if you think about it that way. So you just continue to build this structure, or you build supporting structures that support the dominant structure. And you can continually do this. And that's what determines these baseline that interoceptives is trying to really connect with.
And so what you guys have just described then is that as we get closer and closer to this powerless point, what we are encountering is, I'm going to call it abnormal human behavior, or some sort of, there is some underlying organic, psychological, physical, whatever issue. And this person is not behaving at all inside of the range of normal. But the change grid is supposed to have a spot on it for every single possibility, including the worst of the worst. And so that's why I decided to bring this all up. I want to go like, well, is it possible that those individuals are receiving such a flood of dopamine and such a flood of adrenaline that this is what's underlying their ultimate behavior? And if we could change those, I know they put people like that on all kinds of different sorts of medications, but if it's really about neurotransmitters being out of balance or misbehaving, is that a therapy that you guys are aware of for these kinds of, you know?
Oh, I'm sure there's all kinds of drugs for it.
Yeah, but it seems like what they're missing is serotonin, because you're saying that the counterbalance for dopamine would be serotonin, and obviously for epinephrine it would be norepinephrine. So yeah, just kind of wondering about that. I just found this fascinating, and I'll share with you without getting into any of the deep details around it, is that I'm quite troubled, as I'm sure all of you are, by what I'm witnessing happening throughout our country. And I'm troubled by what I'm seeing. I'm troubled by what I'm hearing. I'm troubled by what people are reporting upon and what they're saying, because I kind of feel like everyone is either in this out-grid danger zone where they have become addicted to this aggressive behavior or whatever's going on. They need this. They need to seek out whatever these adjectives are describing, because the dopamine is encouraging them to do so. And similarly, you've got the upgrid people that are very much frightened. They're feeling totally out of control, and so they're doing their best to try to get whatever it is that's threatening them to stop threatening them. But they're coming across as haphazard and reactive and alarmist and all these doomed, imperiled, terrified. Look at these words. And when you've got these upgrade danger zone people added to the mix, they too can become addicted to that fear or addicted to that that alarmist sort of belief system that's coming along. Here we also have obnoxious, overbearing, selfish. Well, what happens when this upgrade group comes into direct contact with his outgrid group, and they're all eating from their bowl of high dopamine, high adrenaline soup?
Yeah, yeah.
Sounds like American culture to me.
Yeah.
That's where we are today. Well, you know,
Right.
and Diane talked about that SSRIs, but they're also SNRI, so the serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. And so you have those that are, you know, when you're using these SSRIs or the SNRIs, you're literally trying to target specific cells to bring people back down. And in many cases it worked, but if the person is just too far off, they need something totally different. And we, you know, unfortunately, you know, there's institutions for people like that for their own good, but you know, we're just becoming a nation that's totally out of balance with oneself. And so it's this outward looking perspective, and that's what dopamine tends to do. That's why you hear a lot of neuroscientists talk about is you know, outward facing, because typically the motivation is typically outside of oneself, but serotonin draws you in. So that's that push-pull effect that I keep talking about. Serotonin will draw you in because you'll step back and reflect that something's out of balance. You'll step back and reflect on what really matters most. And we don't have enough of that going on. And so this is why we're seeing these extremes, because people, you know, I think I've read somewhere like 8 out of 10, and I don't know what age demographic it was, but they get their news from Facebook. I'm like, what kind of news can you get from Facebook?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, a highly vetted source. So, yeah. Now, let's kind of look at the other two though for just a second, because both the downgrid dark side, the downgrid danger zone, and the ingrid danger zone are also receiving some sort of reward because dopamine is also high for them. And so we talked about this before, that the people who tend to be downgrid and like being downgrid get addicted to being downgrid because it's comfortable. It's like, it's lazy. There's no expectation. So a lot of things that one can become addicted to definitely would put you down there. And so I can understand the satisfaction of just going like, the rest of the world doesn't exist. They'll sort it all out. You know, I'm happy in my own little world. Nothing's threatening me. And so I can kind of see where there's a little dopamine reward that's just telling me to just stay inside, do your own little quiet little world. Don't really worry about it. And then we talked about the ingrid danger zone being people who tend to have very low self-esteem, where, by the way, downgrid danger zone people have extremely high self-esteem. They believe that they know everything they need to know. Remember, to end up in apathy, you have to perceive your ability as being extremely high, and the challenge is being extremely low. And so this is the domain of the know-it-alls. So these people are finding great comfort, great satisfaction being able to say, yeah, I told you so, I knew this was going to happen, or, you know, this has happened 900 other times, or whatever the case may be. So that's very different than the person who's in the ingrid danger zone, who believes that their ability is extremely low, but the threat they're facing is also extremely low. So they kind of withdraw in a almost a survival instinct. So if they choose not to participate, if they consciously say, I'm not going to step out of this one little spot that I know for at least now I'm safe, I'm okay. And so is there its own little reward that in that moment at least, you're okay, and maybe that's reward enough. But what both of these little wedges are missing is any particular level of adrenaline or even noradrenaline. So they are low for both of these. If we go back to what we've been looking at, we know, if I look at this one again, well, epinephrine is certainly not going to be in the in-grid or the down-grid danger zone. And norepinephrine, assuming there's always some of it present, there's not much happening. And so you've got no adrenaline, no norepinephrine coming along into play. Your learning is very, very low as far as GABA is concerned. Was that GABA? Yeah, that's GABA. Yeah. So you put all those together, and these become the another set of the population who's basically observing it in a rather either oblivious or unconcerned sort of way.
And see, they would need acetylcholine in that state, because what acetylcholine will act is a spark. Acetylcholine is synthesized in the nerve cell endings.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in the space of, the synaptic connections. And so that's why as a modulator, it will modulate the dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin.
Right. And that would move them then to the center of the
Right.
change grid. We said this, by the way, what you're looking at, I don't want to change the scale of the diagram, but this is acetylcholine, which is very much associated with learning. And we've had our discussion about how learning takes on different forms and different modalities. But if we look at the essential place of knowledge, learning, access to memory, those good sorts of things, it's that center. So I think that it would be great if we could get these people that are too far down grid to move up a little bit. Come on, the people that are in grid, step out a little bit. But how do these people that are too far up grid and too far out grid, how does their behavior, or even observing their behavior, knowing of their behavior, impact the people that are in grid and down grid? Edie, looks like your hand's up. You feel free to share whatever you want to share. Oh, yeah. You should be able to. Yeah. Okay, thoughts about that? Is anyone else concerned about this little, how everyone's bowl of soup is playing itself out in a very vivid way right now?
Yes.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I just don't know how to answer that question, but yes.
Yeah,
There's-
Ellen, go ahead.
There's no one representing the need to reflect.
Right.
Yeah.
There's no representation of that in the media because it doesn't sell.
Right.
And so if you want to talk about dopamine rewards, let's take a look at the people running the press.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, the closest to it is PBS, in my experience. I mean,
Yeah, I don't remember the name of the document, but there was we spent several calls talking about all the different media outlets and news originators and their levels of bias. And certainly, if we're looking at the dark side of the change grid, what do you think? High levels of bias are likely to be encountered, or low levels of bias?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Where if I go to the interior of the change grid, if we go back to dopamine for just a second, to me, what has always disturbed me about the dopamine layer is that it seems to mean that when you are in the center of the change grid, there is no real reward being given to you. There's no bonus. There's no, here's your little dose of dopamine, is our way of saying good for you. But you get a heck of a lot of serotonin. And so maybe in the world of joy and peace and harmony, serotonin would be preferential over dopamine.
Well, it's just
Yeah.
the relief from the anxiety and the stress, I think, is
Could be a
the
reward all by itself. Exactly right. Because, you know, these two do kind of complement one another. So, yeah.
You know, I'm thinking
And
about what Kathy
Pete,
said about PBS, and I would say, you know, what's interesting, I think, so first I would say, who do they invite on to PBS?
Mm,
Because I watch Washington Week in Review. And so you can have people who talk very downgrid, but it's all infused still with bias. It's just that it's not so hysterical.
Yeah.
When I say PBS, Edie, I'm talking about the PBS NewsHour with Judy Woodruff. That,
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
And,
yeah.
I haven't seen that, but
Yeah,
I think that's what to look for
yeah.
is there an exposition of both sides or multiple sides? And are they seen as sort of equally you know, equally good or equally bad, if you will, but there's a sense of that it's really being examined.
yeah.
Yes, and that's they try to do that. That is their format.
Yeah.
That's what they try
Well,
to do.
personally, I've stopped looking at all news outlets
Yeah.
except for fact-checking sites, and even then I read multiple fact-checking sites because while there's far less bias encountered in them, there's still, I mean, a human being is writing whatever is being written. And, you know, someone is editing what they've written. And so these are still humans who have got their own little biases, but hopefully they've, you know, neutralized them to whatever degree they can. But yeah, now,
You
It's
know
gotten,
what, T? I got to tell you that. Okay, talk, Brian, and then I'll say my little comment.
yeah, I think it's gotten to the point where you talk about these rewards where people are, you know, I grew up in a lot of third world countries. And so, you know, people can become desensitized to the things that really matter. So, you know, I think that's where it seems like America is to me. Like a lot of these issues at hand that are impacting humanity, the very citizenry of the country is, you know, you can play the game of apathetic, but somewhere it's going to, you know, it's going to affect you. And I think there's this desensitization that's happening where people are just, you know, apathetic is kind of like a new norm of sorts. I don't have to engage, and it's very dangerous.
well, particularly if the people that are too far out grid have told all the downgrid people that they don't need to get active or worry about it because their greatest concerns are already taken care of. Remember that down in apathy, while people will say they're very much in control, it's also where we encounter an illusion of control. So superficially, they feel totally safe, secure, happy, and healthy because that's the message that they've been given and the message they've chosen to accept as the truth. So sooner or later, they're going to recognize that that's not, in fact, the case, and suddenly they're going to move. So they're not going to feel in control anymore.
You know, Brian, the other thing I'm noticing that occurs to me from what you said is the excitatory potential of the focus on the trivial. Like, did this person say this? Did Trump say this? Or did Biden say this? Or did, you know, and it's all about trivial stuff. It's not about, is China eating our lunch? And do they have a long-term strategy? Or what is the implication of hollowing out the center of the country and people not having access to good wages and you know, things that could be talked about as macro trends and things that are really going to, in 10 years, impact the kind of life we have in this country. But instead, we are talking about, you know, back in January, were you the first one to blow the whistle on this, on coronavirus? And, you know,
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about are when we learned about the different techniques that the media can use to manipulate us or people can use to manipulate others. One of them was getting people to put so much attention on you know, the little squirrel, the little more bright shiny object, or the one little issue that's kind of peripheral to the central issue, that they no longer look at the central issue.
I'd love to comment here. I think that one of the downsides of social media, particularly Facebook, has been the narrowing of scope and perspective of the intellect and the mindset of the community that it addresses, that the scope gets smaller and smaller. Look at what I ate today. You know, I mean, I'm being extreme, but that's what a lot of people focus. I mean, that's why I can't do Facebook. That's where a lot of people focus on, instead of let's expand our scope and try to understand the system, the macro perspective, the big picture, because I think that's really too hard. It's getting too hard for most people, combined with the fact that our school systems are so poor now and so badly funded that children are not taught to have those critical thinking skills, and that systemic kind of thinking, I think, is a norm in American society. I don't know what you think about that. That's my perspective. I think we've lost a lot of our capability for critical thinking and systemic thinking, if it ever existed.
I think it's because we're on overload, and when that happens, people seek to go to a place where they feel control, and they have control over where they eat lunch that day.
Yes.
And so it goes back to that. I've always noticed that, you know, men who sit in the garage and play with their lawnmowers, they like projects because they are in control of their destiny. And because people are so out of control, I honestly think that's one of the reasons we're going into minutia. Anyway, whatever.
Yeah, no, good point.
Let me add another little element to this. Again, going back to your guys' core training in the change grid. If we look at these concentric circles that you're seeing right here, so from the center of the change grid, we have this green circle. Then further out, we have this big red circle. This is where we talk about balance on the change grid. And one of the things that we talk about is, what kind of information is someone oriented to, or what is their orientation as far as their relationship with the rest of the world around them? And we say that in the center of the change grid, someone is able to appreciate, incorporate, understand, factor in whatever, observe, use whatever word you really want, what's going on with themselves personally, what's going on with other people around them, close or even distant, but others around them. And they're also able to take pure information, pure factual, concrete information. They appreciate all three of these perspectives. They balance out all three of these perspectives. They seek out information of all those three different varieties, or input of all those three varieties. As someone moves away from the center of the change grid, one of those begins to suffer, and that is information suffers first. So the first thing we lose is information. Now, as we move between or towards the green, or between the green and the red, we are more interested in how something affects us personally and others. But the information itself, we don't put that much of a weighted score on it. We really just go like, wait, how's this affecting me? How's this affecting other people that I care about? And as you move even further away from the center of the change grid in any direction, you get close to this red line and beyond it. And when you are beyond the red line, concerns about other people fall by the wayside, and you become completely self-oriented. Now, the self-orientation that one expresses in the out-grid danger zone is very different than the self-orientation that someone experiences up-grid or in-grid or down-grid. But their appreciation or their factoring in of how things affect other people is going to suffer greatly, and certainly their focus on actual truth is gone. And so that's again part of the problem when you're looking at the dark side of the change grid. The thing that I know does not live on the dark side of the change grid is truth. And so this is all someone's distortions of reality. This is all, you're looking at things that would be outside of the red circle. This is all driven very much by whatever self-motivation, self-orientation happens to be, whether it's preservation, whatever it is. It's still about the individual, not about how it's impacting other people or what's actually going on. So.
Thank you, T. That was really wonderful to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, well,
That
yeah.
was brilliant. So
Yeah, and
that's what
so,
I call interoceptive awareness. So when I talk about sensations, perceptions, thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, you have to have a balance there. So I was sharing with T that, you know, my mail from Florida is being forwarded to me here in the Washington, D.C. area, and I received my voting registration to vote by mail. And this mail came, and I had these sensations almost like, you know, anxiety attack. Like I didn't know what was going on. So I remember my cohort here, Kathy, taught me some breathing. And
mhm,
so I immediately did some breathing techniques and calmed down. And I just had to reflect on the moment, like, wow, this is my first election I'm participating in.
mhm.
Ah,
You know, and I open up the envelope, and it has all kinds of ancillary kinds of information, like this is your registration back home, you know, in Florida, and they show you your percentage of participation against others in the United States. So mine was low because I never voted before.
Mhm.
So I'm looking at all this stuff, and it's in, you know, bringing up feelings in me. So I just had to remind myself that it is important. It's almost the same thing when I went for naturalization. You know, you either pass the test or you don't.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I know you're registered to vote in Florida. I will say that it's a shame that you can't be in Florida to vote, because if it's
Yeah.
your first time to vote, there is kind of a special feeling of going to a polling place and, you know, going through and, you know, physically doing all that I don't think people that are voting purely by mail get. So voting by mail is very convenient, and for some people it's very necessary. But you know, all of you guys, you've all voted in person before. So am I right? There's a special feeling that
Yeah,
comes from,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
It's a,
yeah,
it's a community thing. You feel like you're part of
yeah,
the broader
it
community,
really,
and
really
it's,
does. And they
yeah,
give you a sticker, and so
right. They
that's
give you a sticker. Yeah.
yeah.
So
Everybody wants that
you've given
sticker.
your dopamine. You've got your
Yeah, there
dopamine.
you go. Exactly. Dopamine in the form of a sticker.
Right.
Um,
Ryan, congratulations. I'm happy.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so
Thank
if since this is your first time voting, we can share with you some things to expect. There's going to be a whole bunch of stuff on those ballots, and you're going to go like, "What the heck is this?" You know, there's going
Yeah.
to be all kinds of what do they call them? Proposals. No, I forget what they're actually called, but you're supposed to vote whether you are in favor. You know, I think the proposals, whether you're in front of this, you're kind of going like, "I have never even heard of this proposal."
Are you talking about referendums that they put on?
Sometimes it's referendums.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just like, you know, they tell you that like, okay, like I think in Arizona again, it's going to be about recreational use of marijuana, because we have medical marijuana is okay, but not recreational. Meanwhile, we're surrounded. Every other state we seem to touch has got recreational, so it's all kind of like, what's the point? But nevertheless, that's the kind of thing. So, are you in favor of it or are you against it? And there might be also things about the municipalities are trying to get your vote on different tax kinds of things or whatever. But I think if you're going in there thinking like all they're going to do is ask me who I want to be as president and the representatives and the senators and all that, oh no. there could be multiple pages of stuff.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
voting is local. It's very local. So
Yep.
depending on what town you're in, you're gonna be asked questions about. We get a lot of land use questions. Do you want to?
Right. And
Do
we
you
got
want to?
one. We
Yeah.
got one that they want to know who we wanted to have as being, I don't know the title, but the Grand Emperor of Waste Disposal. And I'm just kind of going like, this is an elected official? Okay. So, yeah, it's quite the experience. Quite the experience.
So T, and they're called propositions.
Propositions. Thank you.
And what Brian can do is either go to the League of Women Voters or Vote 411, and all you have to do is put in your zip code, and up comes everything you can possibly think of, or that you want to know about, including voting guides, which the League is known for putting together. They give all the sides, they're very nonpartisan. They give all the pros and cons of all the propositions and the candidates. And or you could just go to, like, we go to Maricopa County .vote, and that's our county. So all you have to do is go to your county where you're going to vote, and they'll have all that information too.
No.
Ah,
Yeah,
okay.
there is opportunity, because here's one thing you probably don't know is that when you get to a polling place, if you were to go to a polling place, it's against the law for anyone to talk to you about anything that's on the ballot within X number of feet. So of the whole polling place. And so it's supposed to be a very sacred place where everyone is there to do their own thing totally in private, and it's against the law to get too close to anybody and try to sway their vote or anything like that. So yeah, so anyway, it's a shame you're not going to be in Florida to be able to actually experience what voting is really supposed to be like, but there you go.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would really like to just, I know we only have about 10 minutes left, but I'd just like to see if we could get one more of these neurotransmitters talked about. The remaining two, I think, are actually pretty straightforward. This particular one is glutamate. Glutamate is apparently very much connected to GABA. Is that right,
Yes.
Brian?
It's the precursor for GABA.
Okay, and so they say that glutamate is a memory neurotransmitter, most common brain neurotransmitter, involved in learning and memory, regulates development and creation of nerve contacts. So it's doing a lot of stuff on the physical side of things as well as on the cognitive or behavioral experiential side of things. So the question was, well, if it's doing its job, where should it move you on the change grid? And as we were chatting, we kind of went like, well, the moment you talk about enhancing your memory, enhancing your, what was the other thing they said? Learning, regulating, anything like that, I start hearing words that seem to imply a balanced place. And so I go like, I would imagine that glutamate is going to be something that's going to move me to the center. Does that
Yeah.
sound right, feel right, Brian?
Yes, because remember, glutamate and GABA, their main main functionality is all about signaling. So they help the nerve cells to signal and fire with one another. There's actually another one, because these are amino acids. So there's actually glycine is another one that would be in that category. And so glutamate literally happens within the cells, and it has to take place within the cells. And
All
there
right.
has to be a right amount at the right time, because then, you know, that keeps these cells regulating and functioning in its proper form.
And so it really, as I've shown it here, I show that it has kind of like a rather confined sort of an impact zone, but you're really saying it occurs across the entirety of our experience.
Yes.
So this needs to be stretched. I will fix these diagrams when we do our final merging of brilliance call. That's when we take everything we've talked about for hours upon hours and reduce it to a single hour for others. But so it would have more of this kind of impact. In the danger zones, is there much going on? Can I make those a little less involved?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, that's good. All right, we'll leave it there.
Yeah, because when you get in the danger zones of glutamate, remember I said, like in certain processes, too much of the glutamate, some of it becomes a precursor for GABA, but too much of it could literally kill brain cells. Because you're talking about salt. So, you know, imagine short-circuiting, imagine pouring salt on like open wires, you know, it's going to short circuit it. And so you don't want that to happen. So when glutamate forms, and again, this happens inside the cells, it knows exactly what to do. So when it's formulated, it formulates the right amount at the right time to help the nerve cells and receptors connect.
All right.
Brian, I have a question, Brian. Is that what, when they talk about cell salts, is that what is?
Exactly.
Okay.
Because it forms from glutamic acid. So like athletes take glutamine because these are the peptides, the precursor for protein.
Yes, because I've taken cell salts, yes.
And so, Brian, get back to this thing that at a certain point it can become destructive.
Yes.
Tell me how that destruction would manifest itself.
So think
would you
about
die?
like, yeah, you actually can die from it. So like because the production of it in abundance really becomes like the acetylcholine's.
Yeah.
And so it's instead of like, and think about neurotransmitters of like PTSD, where you have this cortisol that presents acetylcholines. And then if it doesn't do that right, the production of serotonin is what you want to happen, but instead it'll form glutamate. So glutamate is there, and then too much of glutamate, because you have this process that wasn't supposed to happen. So now all of a sudden, with this extra glutamate there, you're short-circuiting the brain, literally.
Okay, and so now the question becomes, if too much was being released, where am I moving on the change grid? Because I don't think that I'm going to have that explosive, you know, brain bomb in the exact center of the change grid. That seems to be where glutamate would be at its most beneficial.
Well, it's going to be short-circuiting things, so things are starting to like, think about it like powering down. Because remember, GABA are like the brakes, right? So too much of glutamate, then the nerve signaling isn't happening. So that means that now you have nerve cells that aren't functioning at their right capacity. So you start to see things powering down. Because remember, they use like GABA for things like seizures. So,
okay,
you know,
see, now when you're talking about powering down, to me that also feels like something that could be happening at the exact center of the change grid. You know, when people are achieving whatever the highest level of meditation or Zen or whatever word you want to use to describe that, I know that people can also do a lot there to control pulse rate, breathing rates, all sorts of let's say interactions with the world around them. They can kind of separate themselves. Is that shutting down?
that's powering down, but it's active.
Okay.
So you have active cells that are helping you to do that. You're slowing down your you know, some of these executive functionalities in terms of the cortex. So you're slowing that down, but it's still quite active. When I'm talking about powering down, I mean like the capacity for one neuron to excitatory to connect with another isn't happening. And so when those aren't happening within the cells, you're starting to power down this oxygen and other things that flow into the brain matter. So, you know, you start to lose oxygen in your brain matter, you're going to be in trouble.
Right. And so again, you know, my hope is I can find a way that this would map onto the change grid. And so when you talk about someone experiencing a true physical death, I mean, that seems to be an outgrid thing when people just outgrid themselves into a massive coronary or seizure. I think you could also have death occur very far upgrid because you really could be in a life or death situation. People that are downgrid die very quiet deaths. And similarly, people that are very far in-grid. If we talk about energetically, can you die from being too far down-grid? The answer is yes. Can you
What
die?
about in-grid? What about in-grid, T, for this?
That's my thought too. But it's like, then you're kind of, you're not really living. You know how some people, I don't know if it's actually possible, but we've watched several movies lately where it has been presented as possible to die from loneliness.
Yeah.
To that the people just kind of disappear. They lose the will to live.
Well, and I'm thinking about, I cuddle neonatal preemies, not right now, but I normally do. And without that touch and that contact, it's called failure to thrive.
Right, right.
I wonder if that's the similar phenomenon. I don't know.
Yeah, it could certainly be. But see, this is why I'm very curious, because if we are saying that glutamate is involved in everything, but when it gets to be too much, it starts shutting things down. By things, are you talking about neurological processes, physiological processes, organs, all the above?
All the above. Because imagine like you, tightness in your face, like facial pressure, or, you know, I talked about interoception where you feel in sensations. If you can't feel like, you know, I'm standing up right now. So if I can't feel myself standing up, I'm going to hit the ground. right?
Yeah.
So you get this numbness, you'll get tingling, there's all different kinds of sensations, and those are signals that something isn't connecting right. And so you'll get all of these, and you know, it just worsens. It becomes worsened because you're not addressing the issue.
And so,
Heart
what did I just
fluttering.
diagram? Don't mind me. Send it back. Okay. So Brian, then it feels like maybe this is the case, that glutamate is getting stronger and stronger as we move away from the center of the change grid. I think we need to really think about this one a bit more and find out what's happening. And maybe, just maybe, it's possible that it does one of these things. Y'all, I need an expert in the, so maybe it becomes too much of a problem, too far out grid. But yeah, we need to kind of look at it, because you're saying, look, no, there's a sweet spot for glutamate and then there's a problem area.
Right.
And so we need to figure out where those might be. We're actually over time, but
is
yeah.
Situational a lot of times. So, you know, like if you're taking in, like people take glutamate, like say it's an actual supplement. And so the supplement is meant to target specific cells. And so a lot of times, like caffeine or something like that will inhibit the effect of GABA and or glutamate. So there's other things that are situational that would impact it.
Yeah, and again, the change grid is all about a map of situations. So I'd be very curious to see under what situations would we find glutamate coming into positive play, and under what circumstances is it in dangerous play. So yeah, all right, well, we'll save that for Thursday. I also did want to talk about endorphins. Endorphins are all about happy moments. So in any and every way you wish to think of those. And so I'm thinking, before we have deeper discussion, it's kind of centering around the expressive driver kind of area. And then Brian, I added histamine only because you kind of have said multiple times that it really should be on this short list. That, you know, if we needed to add number 9, histamine would be the one you would want to add. And so I thought, well, I'll make a slide for it. We'll see if we get there. Okay, so everyone, thank you so much for joining us on today's call. On Thursday, we'll see what we can do to resolve what's starting to look like a Christmas tree viewed from the top. And we'll see what we can do with the endorphins. Okay, thanks everybody. Bye for now. Take care.
Bye-bye.